The torches flickered against the high walls of the twins, their light casting jagged shadows over the great hall. Laughter, drunken voices, the sound of flesh slapping against flesh as men clapped each other on the back, an illusion of celebration. Robb Stark, king in the north, sat at the high table beside his new uncle, Edmure Tully, and across from Walder Frey. Something gnawed at the edge of his instincts, a feeling of wrongness he could not shake. Then, the music changed. The moment. The first note of the Rains of Castamere echoed through the hall. Robb knew. The wrongness that had lurked in his mind took form, sharp and cruel. His mother's face twisted in horror as she turned to him. "Robb!" Catelyn Stark's voice broke through the drunken haze of the feast. Steel flashed. The first arrow struck his shoulder. Pain bloomed, hot and sharp, but instinct took over. He had to move. Walder Frey's voice was drowned out by screams. Men in Stark colors fell, pierced by crossbow bolts fired from the balconies. The Freys moved in, drawing blades, cutting down. Robb's loyal men before they could react. But not all of them died helplessly. Great Jon Umber, always quick to his feet, smashed his tankard into a Frey's skull and bellowed, "To the king!" Chaos erupted. Robb struggled to rise, his body sluggish from the wine, his blood running hot from the wound. A second bolt drove into his ribs. His vision blurred, but he saw his mother lunge at Walder Frey's wife, pressing a dagger to her throat. "My son," Catelyn whispered, voice thick with desperation. "Let him go." Walder Frey only smiled. Then the blade slashed, and Catelyn Stark's wail filled the hall. "Escape. I must escape." A hand seized his arm, dragging him backward. "Come." "Your Grace," a familiar voice. Mage Mormont, the fierce warrior woman. She had seen the trap unfold seconds before it was sprung, and now she carved a path through the enemy with an axe in one hand and a dagger in the other. Robb's legs barely obeyed him, but survival burned through his veins. He stumbled after, Mage who cut down a Frey soldier as they burst into the side passage. Behind them, Stark men still fought, though fewer by the second. The Greatjon was roaring, throwing men from the high table like dolls. But he was surrounded. Gray winds. Howls came from outside. "I won't leave. Eat, you must." Mage's voice was steel. "The North needs its king. Go." With one last glance at the carnage, the men who had sworn to die for him doing just that, Robb forced himself to run. The cold air hit Robb like a slap as he stumbled out of the side door, blood seeping from his wounds. The sounds of battle still roared within the twins, but outside, in the darkness beyond the torches, more of his men were being cut down. Gray wind snarls and the screams of dying men echoed through the courtyard. Frey soldiers had trapped the direwolf in a pen, stabbing at him with spears. "I have to save him." But then Mage Mormont shoved him forward. "No time, lad," she hissed. "If you stop, you die." The pain in his ribs throbbed with every breath. His legs felt weak, but he forced himself forward. Around him, the last of his bannermen were making their final stand. The Greatjon had not come. He had been lost inside. Mage dragged him toward the stables. They weren't alone. 3 Northmen followed, faces grim with the knowledge that they were abandoning their brothers. But they had no choice. A group of Frey soldiers rushed toward them. Mage Mormont didn't hesitate. She roared and threw herself into the fray, her axe carving through flesh. "Go!" she bellowed as she fought. Robb hesitated. Mage looked at him once, eyes fierce. "For the North." Then she turned back to battle. Robb clenched his jaw and ran. He had been too slow to save his mother, too slow to save Grey Wind. He would not be too slow to save the North. He and his men reached the stables. One of the Northmen, a grizzled warrior named Hallis Hornwood, cut down a stable boy who was rushing to sound the alarm. They pulled themselves onto their horses. Robb's vision blurred. His body swayed. The wounds, the wine, the exhaustion. He was barely holding on. But he dug his heels into his horse's flanks. With a final look at the burning lights of the twins, at the blood that soaked the riverbank, at the castle that had become a graveyard, for his people, Robb Stark rode into the night. The road to vengeance. They rode hard. The cold wind burned against his skin, but Robb barely felt it. Every breath was agony, his wounds still bleeding. His horse carried him through the darkness, galloping toward salvation, or toward nothing. By the time they stopped, dawn was creeping over the horizon. Robb nearly collapsed as he slid from his saddle, barely caught by Hallis Hornwood. "We need to get those wounds tended," Hallis muttered. Robb groaned. His head swam. A camp was made in a small wooded hollow, hidden from the road. The remaining Northmen, only 3 of them now, did what they could. They cut his tunic open, revealing the damage. The arrow in his shoulder was a clean wound, but the bolt in his ribs was another matter. "This will hurt, Your Grace," Hallis warned before pulling it free. Robb didn't scream. He bit down, tasting blood. When they were done, he leaned back. Against a tree, breath ragged, the others sat in silence, their faces hollow. Hallis finally broke it. "What now, Your Grace?" Robb looked at him, dazed. What now? His mother was dead. His army was gone. The Freys and Boltons had betrayed him. The Lannisters would celebrate his downfall. The war, the dream of the North's freedom, was over. But as the pain sharpened, his mind, as the cold reminded him he was still alive, he realized something. The war wasn't over. Not yet. Robb Stark may have lost his army, but he had not lost the North. "The Boltons and Freys think I'm dead," he rasped. "We'll let them think that." Hallis frowned. "Where do we go?" "North." His voice was steel. "The war isn't over. We will take back our home." The wind howled through the trees as Robb Stark tightened his cloak around him, his breath visible in the frigid night. They had been riding north for days, keeping off the main roads, moving like ghosts, through the land that had once belonged to them. The Riverlands had become a hunting ground for Frey patrols, and every village they passed bore signs of the massacre, burned-out homes, corpses strung up as warnings. The Lannisters and their dogs wanted the North to stay broken. But Robb Stark wasn't broken. He had lost his army, his mother, and his bannermen, but he had not lost himself. He would reclaim the North, piece by bloody piece. Hallis Hornwood and the 2 remaining Northmen, Donald Flint and Beric Locke, rode in silence beside him. The further north they traveled, the safer they felt, but they were still only 4 men, in enemy territory. If they were caught, there would be no mercy. It was Hallis who spoke first. "We'll need allies." Robb nodded. "The Manderleys, the Umbers, anyone who hasn't bent the knee to the Boltons yet." Hallis's face darkened. "We don't know who's truly loyal anymore. If we choose wrong, we'll be walking into another trap." Robb's fingers curled into a fist. The betrayal at the Twins had taught him one lesson above all. Trust was a rare and dangerous thing. He could not afford another mistake. They rode through the night, stopping only to rest the horses. Robb's wounds still burned, but he forced himself to push through the pain. He had no time for weakness. It was near dawn when they saw the smoke, a thin black column rising against the pale morning sky. Donald Flint reined in his horse. "That's no campfire." Robb gritted his teeth. "Let's see who's burning." They approached carefully, tying their horses in the tree line before advancing on foot. As they crested the hill, the scene below made Robb's blood run cold. A village, or what was left, of one. The houses had been burned to their foundations, corpses scattered in the snow, flayed corpses. The sign of House Bolton. "They're sending a message," Hallis growled. Robb's jaw tightened. The Boltons wanted the North afraid. They wanted the people broken, so they would never rise against them. But fear only worked on those who had something left to lose. Robb Stark had lost everything, and the Boltons would soon know what it meant to be hunted. The first strike. They waited until nightfall. The Bolton soldiers, no more than a dozen, had made camp in the ruins of the village. They had been celebrating their slaughter, laughing over stolen ale, their armor loosened, their weapons laid aside. They weren't expecting a fight, but they would get one. Robb and his men moved like shadows, slipping through the wreckage. He held his breath as he crept toward the first guard, his fingers tightening around the hilt of his dagger. Then he struck. The dagger plunged into the man's throat, silencing him before he could scream. A second later, the others fell upon the sleeping soldiers. Steel flashed in the darkness. Robb drove his blade into another man's chest, feeling the hot spray of blood against his skin. By the time the Boltons realized they were under attack, it was too late. The last soldier tried to run. Robb caught him, slamming him against a crumbling wall. The man's eyes widened in terror as he looked into Robb's face. "You—" Robb didn't let him finish. He drove his dagger up beneath the man's ribs, twisting until the light left his eyes. The battle was over. Hallie stepped over the bodies, breathing hard. "That's one less pack of wolves for the bastard of Bolton." Robb turned to the corpses strung up in the village square. He didn't recognize them, but they had been Northmen, his people. "We send a message of our own," he said. With grim efficiency, they pulled down the flayed bodies and burned them. In their place, they mounted the heads of the fallen Bolton soldiers. And on the wall of a half-burned house, Robb carved a single direwolf sigil into the wood. The North was not broken, and its king had returned. The bodies burned, sending thick black smoke into the night sky. The flames crackled, devouring the remains of the Bolton soldiers, their twisted faces melting away into nothing. Robb Stark stood before the fire, his breath misting in the cold air, his hands still stained with blood. This was only the beginning. The North had to know he was alive, and the Boltons had to learn fear. Hallis Hornwood stepped beside him, tightening the straps of his armor. "This will get their attention." Robb nodded. "Good, let them come looking." They rode before dawn, keeping to the forests, staying off the roads. The flayed corpses and the Bolton heads left behind would send a clear message. The wolves had returned. If there were still Northmen willing to fight, they would know their king was alive. But finding allies wouldn't be easy. The Boltons had Winterfell. The Karstarks had turned traitor. The Freys and Lannisters controlled the south. If Robb was to win back his home, he needed men, weapons, and something even more valuable: time. For now, he was a hunted man, but soon, the hunters would become the prey. The gathering storm. They rode toward the Wolfswood, skirting the edges of known Bolton-held villages. They moved at night, hiding during the day, taking no chances. Winter was creeping closer, and the air had a bite to it that only true Northerners could endure. After a week of hard riding, they reached the lands of House Manderley. White Harbor was too dangerous. The Manderleys had sworn loyalty to Rose Bolton, but Robb had to believe that their oaths were given under duress. Instead, they made for a smaller holdfast on the outskirts of Manderley lands, where they had heard whispers of resistance. As they approached the village under the cover of darkness, they saw torches moving in the trees. Armed men. Hallis tensed. "Bolton scouts?" Robb narrowed his eyes. "Or friends?" Donald Flint let out a sharp whistle, a northern hunting call. The torches halted. There was a pause before an answering whistle echoed back. Robb dismounted and stepped forward as the figures emerged from the trees. They wore ragged furs, their faces grim and weathered, but when they saw him, their eyes widened in shock. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a thick beard, stepped forward. "Gods be good." His voice was hoarse with disbelief. "King Robb?" Robb met his gaze. "The North is not dead, and neither am I." The man dropped to one knee. The others followed. Robb Stark had found his first soldiers. The last Wolf's army, the hidden resistance, was small, no more than 40 men. Most were former soldiers who had fled when the Boltons took Winterfell, living as outlaws, striking at supply lines where they could. But they had no true leader, no direction, until now. That night, in the firelight of their hidden camp, Robb Stark stood before them. He looked into their eyes, men who had lost everything, men who had been beaten but refused to break. "The Boltons think the North is theirs," he said. "They believe they have broken us, that we are leaderless, afraid, scattered. Let them think it." His voice hardened. "Let them believe the war is over. Let them grow comfortable in their stolen castle. And when they do," his eyes burned with the promise of vengeance, "we will remind them who the North belongs to." A murmur spread through the men. Some nodded, others clenched their fists. Hope flickered in their eyes. Robb Stark had no great army, no banners to raise, no lords to declare for him, but he had the North, and the North remembered. The men swore their loyalty that night, kneeling in the frozen earth beneath the North's vast, endless sky. There were no grand declarations, no lords with flowing cloaks, or shining armor, just men who had lost everything and a king who refused to stay dead. The war was not over. Robb Stark had no banners to call, no great army to march, but he had something more dangerous: rage, patience, and the willingness to fight a war in the shadows. The Boltons controlled Winterfell, but they also needed to control the north. They had sent men across the land to enforce their rule: tax collectors, soldiers, and messengers. But these men were not warriors. They were enforcers, growing fat off stolen coin and frightened villagers. Robb Stark would remind them what it meant to fear the wolves. It started small. A Bolton tax wagon went missing on the road to White Harbor, never arriving at its destination. Then another. The bodies of the tacksmen were found hanging from trees, their faces frozen in terror. The sigil of House Stark was carved into their chests. Then in the dead of night, a Bolton-controlled village awoke to horror. The soldiers who had occupied it, the men who had stolen food, taken daughters to warm their beds, laughed as they told tales of the Red Wedding, were found slaughtered in the streets. Throats slit, bellies opened, their bodies left in the snow. The Northmen who had been too afraid to act now saw the truth. The young wolf was still alive, and he was hunting. The news of the attack spread like wildfire, reaching the halls of Winterfell within days. Roose Bolton was a calculating man, but his bastard Ramsay was something else entirely. The reports infuriated him. "Ghosts do not slit throats in the dark," he snarled. "Robb Stark is dead." But the North had begun to whisper otherwise. Villages were refusing to pay Bolton taxes. Small groups of Northmen were vanishing into the forests, forming their own hidden camps. The fear that Roose Bolton had spent so long cultivating was beginning to crack. So Ramsay acted. He took a dozen men and rode north himself. He burned the villages that had aided the resistance. He flayed those who had refused to pay their taxes. He hung the corpses of men, women, and children outside their homes as warnings. But Robb Stark was waiting. It was deep in the Wolf's Wood, in a quiet clearing under a moonless sky, that Ramsay Bolton found himself surrounded. The attack came swift and silent. One moment Ramsay and his men were riding through the trees, torchlight flickering against the frozen ground. The next, arrows rained down from the darkness, striking men from their saddles. Panic set in. Horses screamed. Men scrambled for their weapons, but there was no enemy to fight. The wolves moved unseen, cutting them down one by one. Ramsay had fought before, but this was different. He was used to torture, to fear, to hunting his victims when they were already broken. But now he was the hunted. And then, through the trees, he saw him, a shadow with stark gray eyes moving through the darkness like a wraith. "Robb Stark," Ramsay hissed. His men were already dead or dying. But Ramsay was not a man who surrendered. He drew his sword, laughing, a mad, cruel sound. "They told me you were dead." Robb stepped forward. "They told me the same about you." Then he attacked. Swords clashed under the cold northern sky. Ramsay was quick, vicious, unpredictable. But Robb was a wolf, and this was his home. He moved with precision, striking, dodging, forcing Ramsay back. The bastard was grinning, but there was fear in his eyes now. And then Robb knocked the blade from his hands. Ramsay fell to the snow, panting, blood on his lip. He sneered up at Robb. "Kill me then, but I'll die smiling, knowing my father still holds Winterfell." Robb didn't hesitate. He drove his sword into Ramsay Bolton's throat. There was no grand speech, no moment of mercy, just cold steel and silence. The bastard of Bolton would never flay another soul. Robb Stark wiped the blood from his blade. Then he turned to his men. "We march for Winterfell." The war for the North had begun. Ramsay Bolton was dead, his body left to rot in the cold northern woods. Robb had not taken his head. There would be no grand display, no banners raised in victory. He wanted Roose Bolton to wonder. He wanted the traitor to fear the silence, to question why his bastard had not returned. Because when fear took root, men made mistakes. Robb and his men moved swiftly, gathering forces as they advanced. With every village they freed from Bolton, more Northmen joined their cause. Some were broken men, deserters who had fled when the Boltons took Winterfell. Others were former Stark loyalists, too afraid to fight until now. But the sight of Robb Stark alive, leading the charge, turned them from lost men into soldiers again. Within weeks, his numbers had swelled to nearly 600. Not an army, not yet, but a force large enough to strike, and Winterfell was within reach. Ruse. Bolton sat in the great hall of Winterfell, his cold gaze sweeping over the men before him. His bannermen had grown uneasy. The whispers of the young wolf's return had spread beyond the villages, reaching even the lords who had sworn fealty to House Bolton. "I will not entertain rumors," Rose said, his voice even. "Robb Stark is dead. The North is ours." Ta. Gathered lords nodded, but unease lingered in their eyes. Rose knew why. Ramsay had not returned. His bastard had taken a force north and disappeared, and now villages were falling silent. Bolton tax collectors were found flayed, not in the name of the Dreadfort, but as retribution for what the Boltons had done to the north. Stark sigils were carved into doors, burned into wood. The wolves had returned. Roose Bolton was no fool. He knew this was no band of common rebels. This was war. He turned to his remaining commanders. "We reinforce Winterfell. Double the guards at the gates. Send ravens to our allies." A nervous silence followed. "My lord," one of his men spoke hesitantly, "the Karstarks have not answered our calls. The Manderleys have grown quiet. Even the Umbers are cowards and will bend the knee when the time comes." Rose's voice was ice, but he was not so sure. He could feel the north turning against him, the air thick with something he had not felt in a long time. Doubt. And then the ravens stopped coming. The first attack came at dawn. Bolton riders patrolling the outskirts of Winterfell vanished. Scouts sent to find them never returned. Then, days later, fire erupted from within the outer villages. Smoke coiled into the sky, the sign of Stark vengeance sweeping toward the castle, but it was the heads that truly sent a message. Lined up along the road to Winterfell, the flayed bodies of Bolton soldiers hung from the trees. Not just dead, displayed. A warning. Winterfell was surrounded. Inside the castle, Roose Bolton watched from the walls. His grip on the north was slipping, and he knew it, but he would not surrender. He had held Winterfell once before, after the Red Wedding. He had broken the Starks, shattered the North's armies. He could do it again. But this time there was no Lannister army to back him, no Freys at his side. He was alone, and outside the gates in the forest and the fields, the wolves were howling. The siege lasted 2 weeks. Robb knew he could not take Winterfell by storm. His force, now 1,500 strong with deserters and rebels, was still too small for a direct assault. But he did not need to take Winterfell in a single night. He needed to make Roose bleed. They struck at supply lines, cutting off food and reinforcements. They set fire to the armories, forcing Bolton men to stand watch through the cold nights. They made them afraid, and then at last, Robb made his move. Under the cover of a raging snowstorm, his men breached the walls, guided by villagers who had once served House Stark. The battle was short, brutal. The starving, desperate Bolton soldiers fought, but their morale had shattered long before the first sword was drawn. Robb cut through them like a wolf among sheep. By dawn, Winterfell belonged to the Starks again, and in the great hall, Roose Bolton stood alone, his sword still in hand, though he did not lift it. He did not beg, did not plead. He simply stared at Robb Stark as if seeing a ghost. "You should be dead," he said quietly. Robb stepped forward, blood dripping from his sword. "So should you." He did not give the traitor time for last words. He plunged his sword into Roose Bolton's chest, watching as the man who had stolen the North finally collapsed, lifeless, onto the cold stone floor. The war was over. Winterfell was home again, and the North remembered. The Boltons were gone, their banners torn down, their name erased from the history of Winterfell. The traitors had been purged, and the North had sworn itself to the rightful king in the North. Robb Stark stood upon the walls of his home, looking out over the vast, snow-covered land. The war was not truly over. Lannisters still ruled in the south. Freys still held the Riverlands. But they would fall in time. For now, the north had been reclaimed, and Robb Stark, the young wolf who had been betrayed, who had been left for dead, who had lost everything, had won. The war had taken his mother, his friends, his men. It had hardened him, shaped him into something colder, fiercer. But as he stood in the heart of Winterfell, his people kneeling before him, the banners of House Stark once more flying high, he knew one thing for certain. The Red Wedding had been a massacre, but it had not been the end. The wolf had survived, and he had returned to reclaim his throne.